Hey, good morning everyone. My name is Antonio Graceffo, and today we're going to be talking about the Great Gatsby. Now, when I was at university for my undergraduate, for my bachelor's degree, I studied literature, and one of my areas of specialty is called the expatriate authors. And these are mostly American authors who lived in Paris between World War I and World War II. Can anyone guess the name of one of these authors? Yes.
Hemingway?
Yes, very good. Hemingway was the most famous, that's right. And then number two most famous?
George Orwell?
No, not George Orwell, but you're right. He lived in Paris. And I'm going to talk about George Orwell later this month. I'm going to have a presentation about George Orwell. But actually, F.Scott Fitzgerald is one of the more famous expat authors in that time period. F.Scott Fitzgerald, some authors wrote a lot of books. Louis L'Amour is one of my favorite authors. He wrote about 300 books. Hemingway wrote, I believe, 60 short stories and about 20 books and novels and novelettes. I was about to say Gatsby. F.Scott Fitzgerald actually he wrote This Side of Paradise, Beautiful and the Damned, The Great Gatsby, Tender as the Night, and then he wrote a book called The Last Tycoon, which he never finished. So he actually only wrote 4.5 books. He wrote some novellas, and a novella means it's longer than a short story, but too short to be a book. And he wrote a few of those, about 3 of those. So he didn't write that many books. And in his lifetime, his book that was the most successful was his first book, This Side of Paradise. But later, the book that has become the most famous is The Great Gatsby, and it's considered one of the greatest American novels that's ever been written. Many people believe it is the best. Scott was born in 1896. Anyone here born in 1896? So he would be quite a bit older than even me if he were here today. And he's from a place called St. Paul, Minnesota, which is in the northern part of the United States. It's cold there. He grew up, his family moved a bit. He grew up in New York quite a bit. He attended private schools mostly, and he received his education in private schools, Catholic schools, and then he finally went to Princeton University where he played football, but not European football. He played American football, and he joined the football team, which in America, if you join the football team and you're a boy, you're very proud, and he lasted 1 day. And then the coach kicked him off the football team. But he was there 1 day, but they took this photo, and now, 100 years later, we still look at the photo. While he was at Princeton, so he was about your age, okay, so he was 19, 20, 21 years old, around that time, he wrote his first pieces, and he published them in student magazines, not professional magazines. He did write a book, and it was rejected by the publisher. The publisher refused to publish it. When the First World War came. First World War started in Europe in 1914, but the Americans didn't join the war until quite a bit later. So all the authors and literature enthusiasts in America had deep feelings for Europe, which they'd never seen but only read about. So Americans, even when I was young, we still had a fascination with Europe. So even when I was young, we still read British literature and French literature. And the generation before me, or 2 generations before, like F.Scott Fitzgerald, America was very focused on Europe. We believed that's where all the culture was, and we read their literature. And so a lot of Americans dreamed about Europe. They'd never been there. When the war started, they were seeing the news reports coming back of innocent people in France and England being attacked by Germany, and a lot of Americans wanted to join World War I, but the American government didn't want to get involved in World War I. So actually even some Americans went to Canada and joined the British Army and went to World War I. When America finally entered the war, a number of famous authors, American authors, joined the war, and F.Scott Fitzgerald quit university and joined the Army. A number of very famous authors served in World War I. This is Gertrude Stein. She is one of the expatriate authors that we will talk a little bit about today. She winds up living in Paris. Who is this? Ernest Hemingway. Okay, this is Ernest Hemingway. And he served in World War I in the ambulance corps. He was wounded in Italy. I gave a presentation about him in term 1, I believe, or term 2. John Dos Passos, another famous author at that time. E.E. Cummings, Somerset Maugham, A.A. Milne, Raymond Chandler, C.S. Lewis. Some of you might know a movie and book called Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so he was in World War I. J.R.R. Tolkien. What did J.R.R. Tolkien write? Not Harry Potter. J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings author, also in World War I. The men and women who served in the war were permanently changed by the war. They went to the war, they saw people dying, they saw fighting, they saw a lot of horrible things, and this changed them. And also they were very young. They were like your age, 18, 19, some of them as young as 17 even. When they came back, they found it very difficult to just go back to university or to go get a job, and they became lost. Gertrude Stein, the woman I just showed you a picture of, she served in World War I, and she came up with this name, the Lost Generation. And it didn't mean they were dead, it meant that they lost their direction. They didn't know how to reintegrate into society after going to the war. Now some of you are going to go study in Australia or America or Britain or someplace, and you might find when you come back it's very difficult to reintegrate into society, to come back to China and live, the same society as everyone else. But can you imagine if you went away to a war and you came back, how much more difficult it is? Gertrude Stein said, that's what you are. That's why you are all here. And here is Paris. The young people who served the World War, you are a lost generation. And she herself, this is hers. I don't like to say she's not the most beautiful woman, but she was very, very intelligent. And she became the leader of the Lost Generation authors. In 1919, F.Scott Fitzgerald married Zelda Fitzgerald, and if you look at Zelda Fitzgerald, this style of dress, the hair. One, I think she looks very, very, very cool, right? And this was a very cool time in history. That there was a new kind of music, a new kind of dancing, a new kind of lifestyle for young people, and definitely Zelda and Scott Fitzgerald were like the models for that era. And all of his novels very much reflect the time in which they were written, and generally the cover art, even the version of The Great Gatsby that you guys have read, if you look, the person on the cover could easily be Zelda Fitzgerald, maybe just a different hairdressing or something. So his first book was Tender is the Night, and it became an immediate success. So in 1919 he wrote Tender is the Night, so he was about 23 years old when Tender is the Night came out. It was a big success. He made millions of dollars. He was, I don't know about millions, but he made a lot of money, and he was called one of the greatest American authors already at age 23. Scott and Zelda joined a colony of expatriate authors, mostly American, who were living in Paris. So in Paris at that time, America was rich and Europe was poor. So the Americans could go to Paris and they could live with $100 a month. They could live in a nice apartment. They could eat every day. They didn't have to work. They just sat in the cafes. They drank alcohol. They sat in the cafes. They went to parties. They talked about writing, and some of them actually wrote. Most important friendship that Fitzgerald had, arguably, in Paris was with Ernest Hemingway. If you look at Ernest Hemingway, I've given a presentation on Hemingway. He's absolutely one of my favorite authors, and he's also one of the most photographed authors of all time. So if you go on the internet and you search pictures of Ernest Hemingway, there's millions of them. He was so famous, and so many people took pictures of him, and he was a very distinguished. When he was young, he was very handsome, and when he was older, he was very distinguished. And you see F.Scott Fitzgerald was with the cigarette, the suit, just very cool for that era. Hemingway said, if you're lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you. For Paris is a movable feast. So a feast is like a party, right? It's a kind of party, like a big party where we eat a lot. Paris is a movable feast. We can take that party with us where we go. Lost generation created their own world in Paris, creating new types of art and literature. By far the most famous was Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway, look, this is Hemingway during the war. You look at him in his uniform, right? Just very handsome. This is him as a little bit older. He was a big game hunter. He would go to Africa and different places and hunt lions and I don't know, bears. Do they have bears in Africa? I don't like hunting personally. I'm against it, but he was a hunter. He was a fisherman. Arguably the greatest American writer of all. He wrote 10 collections of short stories, 5 works of nonfiction, 21 movies have been based on his writing. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize. And the Nobel Prize you've all heard of. Pulitzer Prize is the biggest prize for literature, and he won that as well. These are some of his famous books: For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Old Man and the Sea, which I don't know why all Chinese students seem to know The Old Man and the Sea, and Farewell to Arms, which he wrote about his experience in World War I. In Paris, Hemingway and Fitzgerald were part of a group of writers, mostly Americans, who called the Expats, because they chose to live outside of their country. Expat means expatriate, and it means you live outside of your home country. Apart from Hemingway and Gertrude Stein, the most famous expats were Ezra Pound, Pablo Picasso, James Joyce, who you may have heard of, Ford Madox Ford, and John Dos Passos. Have you seen this painting before? Do you know who this is?
Picasso.
Right, this is Picasso. So he was living in Paris at that time. Do you know what country he's from?
Spain.
Right, he's from Spain, but he was living in Paris, and they all knew each other. These expatriate authors and artists that were living in Paris at that time. Hemingway, the lost generation authors, this is very funny, they all knew each other, and they all wrote about each other. So, The Sun Also Rises and A Movable Feast are 2 books written by Hemingway, but F.Scott Fitzgerald is a character in those books. And they all wrote about each other, and you'll see Hemingway characters in somebody else's book as well, and a Picasso character, and so forth. This is The Movable Feast, and of course, he said Paris is a movable feast, and then he wrote a book about Paris. The Sun Also Rises is a book about Spain. He really liked to go to Spain, and he and Scott Fitzgerald would go there. Scott drank they both were very, very heavy drinkers. Scott was actually definitely an alcoholic, and they had numerous car accidents and whatnot, and he writes about that in The Sun Also Rises. The 1920s, so all of this is taking place in the 1920s. This is between the 2 world wars. The 1920s is called the Age of Jazz, and the flappers. And the flapper were these girls, they dressed in this style, and they called them flappers because they sometimes wore rubber shoes that would make a flap, flap, flap sound when they were walking. They called them flappers. They invented new kinds of dancing. And you have to understand that before the 1920s, girls had to be covered, all the way down to their feet. And so these girls are wearing the short skirts. Girls in America before this time never cut their hair, right? Their hair would be very long. These girls all cut their hair off. A lot of them actually had intentionally cut their hair like a boy's haircut. And you see any picture you see from this era, you'll have people well dressed, right? They're always well dressed, wearing suits and things, and they're always dancing. And it was a time when America was quite rich. They had a lot of money. There was all this dancing, all this freedom. New kinds of dress, new styles of art, lots of new things, and very exciting times to have lived in. And New York was considered the unofficial capital of the world, and New York Stock Exchange was soaring. This money was all coming from the stock exchange. Now, can you guess all this money is coming from the stock exchange in the 1920s from the stock market? What happened in 1929?
Black Friday.
Right. What happened?
And there's a storm in the London market.
Okay, right. The stock market. That's right. Very good. Very good. That kind of instinct. During this 1920s period, Scott wrote "Beautiful and the Damned," and about a wealthy couple who lived this roaring 20s lifestyle, but their marriage was falling apart. So he wrote about a husband and wife living in the Jazz Age who were fighting and on the verge of divorce, and it's probably he was writing about him and Zelda. The Great Gatsby, the book that you're reading right now. Now, I'm from Long Island, New York, and Gatsby lives on Long Island, New York. It's one of the many reasons why I love this. And actually, this house is about 1 kilometer from my house. So I see this house every day when I'm home. So Great Gatsby set on Long Island, where I was born. In the 1920s, I was not born in the 1920s, though. Okay. The two cities in the book were called West Egg and East Egg. I don't know how much of the book you've read already, but they talk about these two cities, West Egg and East Egg, which actually is a city called Port Washington in New York, on Long Island. And Port Washington is about an hour by train from Manhattan. So many people who live on Long Island's an interesting place because it's an island. It's a very long island. And people who live there generally work in New York City, in Manhattan. And many of them work in the financial industry, in the stock market or investments. And if you remember in the book, The Great Gatsby, Gatsby's neighbor, Nick is the one who's telling us the story. Do you remember what Nick's job is? Right, he works in New York City and he's selling bonds, right, selling investments. Okay, so same thing here. Okay, so many people on Long Island, rich on Long Island, work in the financial district in New York City, as does Nick Carraway. Same thing, working in finance. Ernest Hemingway read The Great Gatsby. The two men, Scott and Hemingway, they had a very interesting relationship. They were friends. It later ended terribly, and they hated each other. But when Hemingway read The Great Gatsby, he said, "This is the greatest book I've ever read." And he said his dream was that one day he would write something as good as The Great Gatsby. Hemingway was already famous at that time, and he said that about The Great Gatsby. And he felt, even when he died, he felt he'd never written anything as great as The Great Gatsby. Unfortunately, though, for Scott, it's really the only book that he wrote that became so admired, and it was not admired during his lifetime. Other than Hemingway, nobody else liked it during his lifetime. It became famous later. There have been 3 movie versions of The Great Gatsby, and so if you get a chance, you might want to see the movies. There's one movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. That's the newest one. There's an older one with Robert Redford, which is also quite good. And there's an even older one, which is too old. In 1925, when it was released, The Great Gatsby was considered a failure. However, its popularity left. During World War II, the government would make these boxes to send to the soldiers who were fighting in the war. And in the box was Hershey chocolate, cigarettes, and I don't know what else, coffee and different things, and they would put a book in there for the soldiers to read when they weren't fighting, and The Great Gatsby was in this box of books. The soldiers read The Great Gatsby and they really liked it, and when they came back after the war, then the book became very, very, very popular. 500,000 copies are sold each year. So this book today is still one of the highest selling books that has ever been written. Gatsby as the American Dream. Now, a lot of people think, because Gatsby is about these rich people and they're so careless and they only have fun, they don't see the American dream in that, or they don't see the struggle. The American dream, when we talk about the American dream, because now we have the China dream, right? And it's a different kind of dream. We have the American dream. So this is the American dream. This would be, my parents, my grandparents coming to America on the boat. They have no money, and then going from here to living in a beautiful house on Long Island. That would be the American dream. This is the where the immigrants, when you would come to America, now when you go, you fly in an airplane. But when my family came by boat to this island, and this was the immigration processing center before you were allowed to enter the United States. You could be born poor, even in a foreign country, and no one will care who your parents were or what they did. You can become anything you want. You can self-create. That's the American dream. And you have to remember in context that we come from our country. Our people come from everywhere, but our country comes from England. And in England, it was very important. Who is your father? Who's your mother? Were they famous? Were they part of the king's family? And in America, none of that was supposed to matter, only what you did. So Gatsby self-creates. Now, have you finished the book or no?
Only 2 chapters.
2 chapters.
We're only starting.
Okay. So the life that Gatsby lives, think about Gatsby's life. Does he work? No. Does he have children? No. What does he do?
And hold some parties.
That's it. That's his whole life. He has some parties. He wears a lot of nice clothes. Eats a lot of good meals. He has lots of friends, or he knows a lot of people. And this is his life. He doesn't have to work. He doesn't have to take care of children. He doesn't have to anything. Okay. Gatsby's life is like a dream. Right? Gatsby's life is like a dream. Is it like real life? Is it like your life? No. Gatsby lives in a fantasy world. But the interesting thing about Gatsby created his fantasy world. He created it himself. So in a way, Gatsby is the American dream because he created his world. He created his life himself. Doesn't matter who his father was. Doesn't matter who his mother was. How long has his family been in America? Doesn't matter. He created a world for himself. And that, in a way, represents the American dream. He was born poor and earned his money through crime, bootlegging. He was selling illegal liquor. We'll find that out later in the book. So Gatsby represents the American dream because Gatsby invented himself. He invented the world that he lives in. He invented his life. It's a fiction. Nick Carraway also represents the American dream. Nick Carraway is born far away from New York in a small town, and he comes to New York to make his fortune, become rich, to work. So he also represents the American dream. So it's very important to understand that both of these people, in their own way, are representing the American dream, except that Nick is actually working, whereas Gatsby is sort of living a fantasy. In 1929, what happened? Black Friday. Okay, we call this the Great Depression, right? First we call this stock market crash, fell down. And then number 2 is the Great Depression, okay? Oh, excellent. When that happened, do you know which country was affected the most by the Great Depression? America was affected the most. And basically, it wound up affecting the whole world, but America was affected the most. So those expat writers and authors that were living in Paris, they were getting money from their parents, a lot of them. Suddenly, there's an economic crisis in America, and the parents can't send them money anymore. So they had to go home. So basically, the expat life in Paris ended because of the crash of the stock market. F.Scott Fitzgerald never wrote an autobiography. He never wrote a book about his own life. However, he wrote The Great Gatsby. And we often cannot separate the man from the character. Gatsby, in some ways, is a fictional representation of who he, F.Scott Fitzgerald, wanted to be. You'll see there's actually versions of The Great Gatsby where the picture on the cover is not Gatsby, it's actually F.Scott Fitzgerald. Because we can't separate the two. The Great Gatsby as a prophecy. Obviously, Fitzgerald did not know the Great Depression was coming. It's very interesting. So he writes this book about this character, Gatsby, that creates this world where he's rich and he just has fun and just parties and they dress really well and they're dancing and everything's wonderful. And then, boom, it all ends. Like that. He wrote that during the 20s. He did not know the stock market was going to end. It's very interesting. It's like he predicted it. So when Gatsby's life ends, it's like the end of the jazz era. In the next 15 years, America will be plagued by unemployment and then eventually going into World War II. And you'll see these are the people looking for jobs. These are the men that would go out looking for jobs. They had no food, and maybe the church or something would give them some food. The children, people would bring food to give to children because they had no food. Things were really bad during the Great Depression. F.Scott Fitzgerald released Tender is the Night in 1934, which was considered a great failure. He had not had a hit since This Side of Paradise in 1920. At the age of 40, was completely washed up. Washed up means he was completely, his career was finished. And no one respected him anymore. His books were out of print. He was a terrible alcoholic. And his wife, Zelda, went crazy, and she was in a mental institution, a hospital. So his life was not going. And if you look at this picture, look how old and terrible he looks. And this is only about 5 years later. That's a very short period of time that he aged so quickly. Meanwhile, Ernest Hemingway, at the same time, Ernest Hemingway was the most famous American author of all time. 10 novels, 10 collections of books, 5 works of fiction, 21 movies, Pulitzer Prize, Nobel Prize, magazines. These are all famous world magazines, and he was on the cover of every magazine. Here he sees even as an old man, he's still famous. He's still on the cover of the magazine. Today he's dead, and he's still on the cover of magazines. Fitzgerald lamented that his friendship with Ernest Hemingway was finished. They tried to still be friends. They'd had some problems. They tried to still be friends, but one of the problems then was Ernest Hemingway was a famous, successful author, and F.Scott Fitzgerald was now washed up, finished, alcoholic. His whole life was a mess, and they didn't have so much to connect with anymore. F.Scott Fitzgerald said, I talk with the authority of failure. Right? He means I am a failure. Ernest Hemingway with the authority of success. We could never sit across the table again. So America was born in a revolution, tempered in a civil war, and passed its adolescence in the Jazz Age. F.Scott Fitzgerald was the author of that age. And all of the famous notables who moved within his sphere were characters he created. The stock market crash in 1929 signaled the end of the feast. The Great Depression was an adult tragedy which had no place for America's eternal youth. Finding no place in this world, Scott chose to move on to the next one. In 1940, he moved on, leaving us with 4.5 novels, 178 short stories. Of all the books written about the Jazz Age, F.Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby is the one which is universally regarded as the best and most accurate depiction of the era. Many scholars believe The Great Gatsby is the greatest American novel. So the Jazz Age was a time for young people, an exciting, fun time for young people. The Great Depression was like the end of that. And right after the Depression, the war. And that was just like the end of the fun, the end of the childhood for my country. And then after that, my country had to grow up and be an adult and get a job and have children. Okay, you've listened to me talk long enough. Now, go read a book and live your life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to Antonio. That was a really great presentation. We learned so much.